1 week since the midterms, but some voters across the country still don't know who will represent them in key positions. Right now, 17 high-profile elections remain up in the air. 2 of them in Florida, the races for U.S. Senator and governor there, were forced into an automatic recount this weekend. It's a legal requirement in Florida when the final margin is less than half a percentage point. The deadline for the machine recount is Thursday. Tensions are mounting on both sides of the aisle. Republican candidate and Governor Rick Scott is suing 2 election officials over the recount process. He says his opponent, Senator Bill Nelson, is committing fraud. The Democratic incumbent leveled his own allegations Tuesday.
Sadly, it's become clear that my opponent isn't interested in making sure that every lawful vote is counted. Instead, he's been using his power as governor to try to undermine the voting process.
Anthony Salvanto joins me now. He is CBS News' elections and surveys director. Anthony, I know it has been nonstop for you since last Tuesday. Hard to believe midterms were just a week ago.
Did you say? Yeah, it was just a week ago. It kind of feels a little longer as the ballots keep coming in.
Like a year ago at this point. So let's talk about Florida. Republican Senate candidate Rick Scott and the president have claimed Democrats are trying to steal the election, while Democratic Senator Bill Nelson's campaign is suing the Florida Secretary of State. Is this how the system is supposed to work?
Well, look, for a larger context, there are always ballots that come in after Election Day. And, of course, mail ballots, where the process is that secretaries of state and people who work in elections will check signatures, check the envelope, go through that process, right? That's something that not a lot of people watch or notice when elections aren't close. Right. And in fact, we know that in many states, not only do those ballots come in later and days afterwards, but there are some places like Arizona, like we just saw, with Sinema last night, in California, where we know they won't count all of their ballots right there on Election Day. On the other hand, there's part of this process, obviously, as this goes into recount, which is at least not typical, right? So you've got the machine recount. That's a process where they're going to stick those ballots back through the machines and see what they come up with. And then if that's still within that quarter point, then they're going to go to the hand recount. And that's not something that we always see. So part of this process is something we just don't always notice, but part of it obviously is something where there's a difference now, and there's the recount.
So as someone who crunches numbers and watches these things inside and out, what is it that you look for when we see these kind of recount situations?
Well, really sort of watching the process and watching what the state officials will certify. I mean, at this point, you can see that there are, in some cases, large gaps between the candidates. And if new ballots come in and that changes, okay, we'll look at that and we'll report that. But at this point, it's really just watching to see what they actually certify, what they actually count, less than it is any kind of fancy math or projections. It's really a question of reporting what gets allowed, what gets processed, and what doesn't.
So help us understand why it is that some of these races are still undecided a week after the election.
Well, a lot of it is waiting for ballots to come in, get checked, and get processed. It really is. Not everything gets counted. And that's particularly true in some of those states I mentioned. So, for example, in Arizona, we figured it would take a number of days, and it often does. That's rather typical in Arizona. So then last night we were able to say that the Democrats had picked up that seat with Sinema in Arizona, right, when enough of those ballots came in that it was clear. And then there's a couple in California still, outstanding, where it's very close, and there might be, 90, 100,000 ballots still to come in and get counted. So we'll wait and we'll see what happens there as those get processed. I think in the larger sense here, here's what we know about the next Congress, right? We know the Republicans are going to control the majority of seats in the Senate. That's given no matter what happens in Florida. We know that the Democrats have the most seats coming into the House. Our estimate there is that they'll get into, it'll be a 30-seat plus gain, right? That's our best CBS estimate as those races start to shake out. So the rest of these, then we'll see how the seats will fall.
So can we talk a little bit about Kyrsten Sinema specifically here in this Arizona Senate race? What were the factors that ultimately gave her the win over Republican Martha McSally?
Well, I think it was, one, her improvement versus, let's say, 2016 versus Hillary Clinton, with white women who held college degrees. That was a demographic that across a lot of these House districts and across all these states, the Democrats were clearly targeting. So she improves, some improvement there. And then I think you saw also her perform as well as she had to with Hispanic voters as well. And from a vote counting perspective, once we saw Phoenix, the Phoenix area in Maricopa County come in, that's the bulk of the voters there, and that's where she had to do well, and ultimately she did.
So Sinema is part of a new group of women entering Congress in record numbers. How did changes in the electorate actually get us to this point?
Yeah, and I think that's obviously a big story coming out of this, right? Is the record number of women coming into Congress. Underpinning some of that from a voting perspective is the large gender gap that we saw, where we saw men, they voted marginally for Republicans, a little more Democrat than they did in the past, but it was that huge double-digit swing or double-digit gap for women, and in particular for women with college degrees, again, that group that Democrats were targeting. And they live predominantly in these suburbs that the Democrats were going after, in these House districts, these suburban House districts, more affluent House districts that we saw flip. And then some surprises, we saw flip as well. And that was a big part of what ultimately flipped the House.
All right, Anthony Salvanto, no rest for the weary, our intrepid elections and surveys director. Thanks so much, Anthony.
Thanks, Elaine.